So yesterday, what we did is we started with chapter 10. We talked about aggregate demand and why aggregate demand looks the way it does. And then aggregate supply, we had short-run aggregate supply and the long-run aggregate supply, which we use as more or less as a marker for where full employment GDP is. So it's it tells you where the economy is in the desired position, so you want to be at full employment. You don't want to be below full employment because then you have unemployment. You don't want to be beyond full employment because that can lead to inflation. So being at full employment, that's the desired position. Okay. Now, this is where we would like to be in this type of position. So here's price level, here is real GDP. And we would like to be in this type of a situation where actual GDP, which is given by the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So this actual GDP is the same as full employment GDP. And what we're gonna bother with, what we're gonna talk about is, well, what happens when we have a recession? And we have a recession where the actual GDP is below full employment GDP. So here's an example of a recession. Price level, real GDP here on this axis. And the actual GDP, we find it at the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and it's going to be here. This is this is actual GDP. And obviously, we have a recession only if actual GDP is less than full employment GDP. So we could be producing, let's say, $15 trillion worth of goods and services, but we turn out to be producing only $10 trillion worth of goods and services. So long run aggregate supply is going to be someplace here to the right of actual GDP. So this is full employment GDP. So that's the purpose of the long run aggregate supply, to show us where exactly is the full employment GDP. And then we can determine whether the economy is in a recession, whether the economy is overheated, or the economy is just right. All right, so what can we do? What can be done in order to move the economy to full employment GDP? Well, in particular, what can the government do? Okay, what is it that the government could do to move the economy to full employment? And there are a number of things. The government can change short-run aggregate supply. They can create more production. Well, how can they do that? How can the government? Because the government doesn't own any businesses. The government doesn't own Microsoft, doesn't own Ford, doesn't own GM, doesn't own Boeing. Okay. Well, what can the government do to give businesses an incentive to produce more, to shift this aggregate supply to the right? What they could do to create an incentive for businesses to produce more is to give them lower costs of production. because we know that the cost of production are shifting supply, and they're shifting aggregate supply too. So if we increase the cost of production, aggregate supply is going to shift to the left. If we decrease the cost of production, aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. Here in this case, we would need aggregate supply to shift to the right. If aggregate supply shifts to the right and ends up here, then we close the gap. We're no longer going to have that recessionary gap because the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand takes place at full employment. Well, here's the question for you. What do you think that the government can do so that it lowers the costs of production for businesses? Remember, the government has only one tool that impacts businesses.
Lower taxes.
That tool is?
Lower taxes.
Exactly. Lower taxes on businesses. So if they lower taxes on businesses, what's going to happen is supposedly, at least in theory, short-run aggregate supply businesses will want to expand, and they will start hiring additional workers. They're going to be producing more output, and the recession is going to be over. They're going to close that recessionary gap. So lower taxes. Well, this was tried some time ago, a long time ago, and where you stimulate aggregate supply. And it was called, anybody, how did we call it when you stimulate aggregate supply? Supply side. Anybody heard of the term supply side economics? No? Okay. Well, it was supply side economics. And unfortunately, it did not work. Why didn't it work? Well, it didn't work because while the government gave businesses tax breaks, and businesses were supposed to take that money and now spend it on hiring additional workers and expanding output and build new plants and do all this stuff that gets the economy going. They looked at the past, and the past was bleak. And they believed that the future was going to be bleak too. And if nobody's going to buy anything, what's the use of hiring workers, building new plants, if your production is not going to be bought by anybody? So they were pessimists, and they got this money, and they said, well, we better hang on to this money. The whole idea was for them to spend the money on new workers, new production, to get the economy going. So that didn't work very well. Okay, so, but in theory, it's a valid theory. In other words, if the government gives businesses a tax break, hopefully, but it didn't happen, but hopefully businesses will take this money and then they will spend it and they will put people to work, and that's going to get the economy going. Okay? Because that's what we have. We have a recession where people are not finding work. Well, let's get them to work. One way would be supply side. Okay, it didn't work, but theoretically it should work. Okay. But remember, theory and reality are two different things. All right, well, let's leave short-run aggregate supply alone. Let's tackle aggregate demand. Let's create more demand for goods and services. Because if we create more demand for goods and services, then people will buy more regardless of the price level. So we shift the whole aggregate demand to the right. Like so. So now we have the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and the new aggregate demand taking place at full employment. The economy has recovered. Well, what can the government do to shift this aggregate demand to the right? Well, let's just think a little bit about where the demand for goods and services comes from. Who demands goods and services? And last class, we talked about who demands goods and services. It's us as consumers, businesses, government, and foreigners. Those are the people who demand goods and services. So we want either us or businesses or government or foreigners to buy more goods and services, regardless of the price. And if that happens, then the whole aggregate demand shifts to the right. And hopefully we're going to be able to close the gap. Well, so we have that aggregate demand comes from C plus I plus G plus NX. And just think about it. What could the government do? What could the government do to increase the demand for goods and services? Remember, the demand for goods and services comes from our consumption, business consumption, government consumption, and net foreign consumption. Give me a very direct way where what would have to happen to any of them to shift aggregate demand to the right? Just give me briefly what would have to happen to either C or I or G or NX in order to shift aggregate demand to the right.
The government could offer stimulus to consumers.
So, but in general,
or subsidies.
Think simpler. Don't be so specific. What would have to happen to either C or I or G or NX in order for that aggregate demand to go up? Would they have to go up or down, those values here?
Those values would have to go up, right?
Those values have to go up, exactly. So either our consumption would have to go up, or business consumption would have to go up, or government consumption have to go up, or foreign consumption would have to go up. If any of those would go up, then you would have a shift, because it implies people will buy more, or people or businesses or foreigners or government will buy more, whatever the
price. Whatever the price is.
Exactly. Whatever the price level. Whatever the price level, more than before. More than before. More than before. Okay. So now here comes the self-evident question. This is actually self-evident. Because we're talking about the government. The government. Which one would the government have the easiest time of increasing?
Government spending.
Government spending, exactly. About with COVID and all that good stuff. Well, the good stuff, the bad stuff. With all that bad stuff. What is Congress trying to keep on passing and passing and passing? All kinds of
stimulus. Like
stimulus packages. What is those stimulus packages? Is increased government spending. So government is sending money to us. Increased government spending. Sending money to us.
How is that like, who's going to pay that back? Or who's going to pay for that?
Well, we're going to pay it later in higher taxes.
All right.
Right. But see, the thing is, because certainly somebody may say, well, who's going to pay it? Who's going to pay it? But if you're out of work, if you can't find a job, what do you want? You want money now, or do you worry about, well, what's going to happen in the future? Who's going to pay that? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. If I'm out of work, I want money now. I want something to be done now. I want a job now. And then we're going to worry about what's going to happen, how that money is going to be paid back in the future. Okay, so one way of stimulating the economy would increase government spending. This G going up. What else could the government do? What else could the government do to get us to spend more money? So what is something that the government controls?
Interest rates?
No, the government, very good. We're going to get into interest rates are controlled not by the government, but by the Federal Reserve. And Federal Reserve is separate from the government. We're going to talk about that when we talk about monetary policy. But for now, we're talking about fiscal policy. I'm going to get into this next class. We're talking about fiscal policy is what the government does. And what the government basically controls is two things, is their spending and something that affects us, and we care a lot about it. Well, in a few months, the bill is going to be, oh no, not in a few months. The bill was due, they delayed it until July 15th or something like that. It was April 15th, and now they delayed it because of COVID. What is that?
The tax.
Taxes, exactly, taxes. So that's what the government controls, spending and taxes. What do you think if the economy is in a recession and the government wants to stimulate the economy? What do you think that they should do to taxes?
Lower taxes?
Lower taxes, in the hope that if they lower taxes on us, what are we going to do with that money?
Spend it.
Spend it. Remember, the whole idea is if the economy is in a recession, you want spending to go up. You want to stimulate spending. It doesn't matter who spends it, whether it's us, whether it's businesses, whether it's government, or it's foreigners. We want more spending. We want to create more demand for goods and services because that in turn creates jobs. So if we want to buy more refrigerators, more washer and dryers, we want to take more trips or whatever, that's going to create jobs. Airlines will need more airplanes. More washer and dryers have to be produced. That means that more workers have to be hired, and that gets the economy out of that recession. So we need to create more spending. And in this case, we're looking at what can the government do? Well, the government controls two things, mainly. It's spending and taxes. And like you said, you need more government spending or you need lower taxes to stimulate consumer spending. So we want to stimulate either C, by lower taxes, or G, by higher government spending. Now, not this class, but some other class, we're going to talk about, well, what are some of the ramifications? Because, well, if you increase government spending, where is that money coming from? Okay, because it's got to come from someplace. They cannot just print it out. Okay, they could print it out, but they can't. Really. It would be very bad. Then if you lower taxes, well, if you lower taxes, that means that people are getting some more money. Again, one problem is, well, what if people are getting this extra money in terms of lower taxes, but they don't spend that money? You know, the government cannot force you to spend the extra money that you have, and that wouldn't stimulate the economy. Okay? And think about it in those terms. If government lowers taxes on us, that means that the government also has
Less income.
less income. The government collects less money because it takes less from us. And if they have less money, that means that they cannot
Spend as much.
spend as much. Yeah, so you see, you have a little bit of a problem here. Okay, so we're gonna have to deal with that, but that's for a later lecture. So folks, let me ask you the following situation. So again, what if we have an economy that looks like this? What do you say about that economy? That economy is operating above that economy is operating above what?
Man, I just watched.
Full employment.
Full employment. Yeah. Yeah, Bardia.
I said, man, I just watched this lecture. How did I forget?
Oh, yeah. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. So here we have an economy that is overheated. And let's say that the government wants to cool off this economy because it could lead to inflation. What could the government do? Because now you should be able to tell me what the government can do in order to cool off the economy, to slow down the economy by stimulating aggregate demand in a negative way, by reducing the demand for goods and services. Can you tell me what the government can do in order to shift aggregate demand to the left?
Raise taxes and lower government spending.
Exactly. Exactly. So in this case, G going down and or taxes going up. Yeah. So exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. So when you have an inflationary or an expansionary gap, you're going to increase taxes or reduce government spending. When you have a recessionary or a contractionary gap, you're going to increase government spending or reduce taxes, or a combination of the two. Can anybody tell me why I'm not discussing this situation here much? I'm not spending too much time on this situation. Because it doesn't happen very often that we say, oh my God, the economy is so good, we better do something to cool off the economy. We tend to enjoy the good times. And if that may lead to inflation, well, so be it. And in general, even when the economy is overheated, it's not going to be the government that will step in and cool off the economy. Because politicians, they don't like to intervene and reduce the demand for goods and services, okay? Because that's going to create some people losing their jobs. Okay? So that's when the Fed, which we're going to talk later after test 2, the Fed steps in because they are not elected by people, and they intervene and they may change interest rates in order to slow down the economy. What do you think that the Fed would do to the interest rates in order to slow down the economy?
Raise them.
Raise them, raise the interest rates. Make it more expensive for businesses, for people to borrow money in order to spend it, okay? Less spending, less demand for goods and services. So always, folks, always, I urge you to think in those terms. If the economy is in a recession, you need more spending. It doesn't matter who spends more. It's us or businesses or government or foreigners. We need more spending to shift aggregate demand to the right. And if the economy is overheated, then we need less spending to shift aggregate demand to the left. So in general, in this class, we're gonna leave supply side economics alone. We're not gonna touch supply side economics, okay? Does it work? Of course it does. You know, it didn't work one time, well, big deal. But we're gonna focus on demand side economics because that's what the government has employed in the past 30 or so years, is demand side economics, where the government stimulates either with increased spending or changing taxes. Okay. All right. This probably concludes chapter 10. I can tell you that I'm going to jump from chapter 10, I'm going to jump to chapter 12 and 13 next week. I want to cover both chapter 12 and 13. In chapter 12, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at, well, okay, let's suppose that we know that the economy is in a recession and is below full employment by $5 trillion. The question then becomes, well, how much should government spending increase, let's say, in order to close that $5 trillion gap, recessionary gap of $5 trillion? Because it turns out that the government does not have to spend $5 trillion in order to close that $5 trillion gap, because there's a multiplier. Okay, so the government needs to increase the spending, but not by the size of the gap, but by less, because that increase in government spending is going to get multiplied. And we're going to talk about that multiplier, how we can calculate the multiplier. So next week on Monday, I'm going to talk about that multiplier, and then I'm guessing that probably on Wednesday, I'm going to be talking about fiscal policy. What does it mean, this increase in government spending, or reducing in taxes, or fiscal policy that goes the other way, where the government is trying to slow down the economy? Okay, so we're gonna cover 2 chapters next week. The last chapter that I'm gonna cover is gonna be chapter 11. So remember, for test number 2, we're gonna have 4 chapters only: 10, 11, 12, and 13. So today we're done with chapter 10. Next week, 12 and 13. The week before the test is going to be chapter 11. And the week of the test, we're going to have the review for the test. Oh, by the way, this is only for all my macro classes. I haven't done it for micro yet. I'll do it after this class, because I got inundated with the research paper. My fault, I did not put a due date. Okay. I created an assignment. So if you go into modules, and you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you're gonna see research paper. And it has a date due. You can turn it in anytime until December 10th. So plenty of time, anytime. You click on research paper, and then you click on submit, and you're gonna click on file link or something like that, upload or something. Anyway, and when you click on that, it sends you to wherever you saved it in Word, and you can upload it then. Okay, so very simple, very simple. You've done it many times. So the research paper due December 10th. I believe the last day actually of classes, last day that you can take the final is December 11th. Okay, so the final, probably like all my tests will be available Thursday and Friday. Thursday is December 10th. Friday is December 11th. I made it December 10th so that if there is a glitch or anything like that, we still have one more day where we can fix it. Okay, that's why. Okay, at this point, I'm gonna stop the recording and I'm gonna post it.